Tonight, we journey into the frozen graveyards of Alaska, where entire towns simply vanished, leaving behind nothing but icy ruins and unanswered questions. 10 ghost towns scattered across America's last frontier hold secrets darker than the endless winter nights. From Portlock, where residents fled in terror, abandoning their homes to whatever stalked them through the snow, to Kennecott, where the copper mines echo with voices of the dead. These are not ordinary abandoned places. Each settlement tells a story of sudden departures, unexplained deaths, and encounters with forces that defy explanation. These are the places where prospectors came seeking gold, but found something far more sinister waiting in the permafrost. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to daily true horror content that will keep you up at night. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. Now, let us step into the shadows of the Alaskan wilderness, where civilization ends and terror begins. The morning fog rolled in from Port Chatham Bay like a shroud, thick and impenetrable, just as it had every morning since Jackson arrived in what remained of Portlock 3 days ago. He pulled his jacket tighter against the October chill and stepped carefully around the rotting timber that had once been someone's front porch. The town that time forgot stretched before him in silent decay, a testament to how quickly nature could reclaim what man had built. Jackson had come to Alaska as a freelance investigative journalist, drawn by whispered stories about the ghost town that nobody wanted to talk about. What he found was far more disturbing than any legend about mythical creatures stalking the woods. The truth about Portlock was written in blood, buried in forgotten police files, and hidden behind 70 years of willful silence. Sam Kowalski met him at the old cannery ruins that first afternoon, an elderly man with weathered hands and eyes that had seen too much. Sam had grown up in nearby Seldovia and remembered when the last residents of Portlock packed up their lives and disappeared overnight in 1950. What the history books did not record, what the official reports glossed over, was the systematic pattern of murders that drove an entire community to abandon everything they had ever known. "You want to know what really happened here," Sam said, lighting a cigarette with shaking fingers. "Then you better be prepared for the truth. Because it ain't no monster story. It's something much worse." The cannery had once been the heart of Portlock, processing thousands of salmon during the peak seasons of the 1920s and 1930s. Russian Aleut families had made their homes here, building a thriving community around the rhythms of the fishing industry. But by 1931, the first in a series of brutal killings had begun to tear the social fabric apart. Andrew Kamluck was the first victim that anyone could prove. Jackson had spent hours in the Anchorage archives, digging through yellowed newspaper clippings and police reports that most people had forgotten existed. Kamluck, a respected member of the community and godfather to several local children, was found dead beside his logging equipment on a crisp morning in October 1931. The official cause of death was listed as blunt force trauma to the skull. What the reports did not emphasize was the nature of that trauma. The coroner's notes, buried deep in the case file, described a crushing blow that could only have been delivered by someone or something possessing inhuman strength. Kamluck's skull had been caved in with such force that fragments of bone had been driven deep into his brain tissue. Blood spatter patterns on the nearby equipment suggested the attack had been swift and savage. The logging crew found him at first light, Sam explained, as they walked through the overgrown remains of what had once been Main Street. Kamluck was a big man, strong as an ox. Whatever killed him did it with one blow. The police wrote it off as an industrial accident, but everyone who saw the body knew better. More disturbing were the details that never made it into any official record. Witnesses described strange markings around the crime scene, footprints far larger than any human could make. The ground around Kamluck's body had been churned up as if by some massive struggle, but the man himself showed no defensive wounds, no signs that he had fought back or even seen his attacker coming. The killings continued throughout the 1930s, following a pattern that grew increasingly impossible to ignore. Cannery workers would venture into the forest that surrounded Portlock and simply vanish. Search parties would find their remains days or weeks later, scattered across the wilderness in ways that defied explanation. Bodies were torn apart with a precision that seemed almost surgical, limbs separated from torsos, heads crushed beyond recognition. Jackson found the most disturbing evidence in a collection of photographs that had been donated to the Alaska State Archives by the family of a former Portlock resident. The black and white images showed crime scenes that looked more like battlefields than murder sites. In one particularly haunting photograph, the remains of 3 cannery workers were spread across a forest clearing, their bodies arranged in what appeared to be a deliberate pattern. The thing that got to people, Sam continued, was how the killer seemed to know exactly when folks would be alone in the woods, like he was watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The official investigation, such as it was, focused on the possibility of a serial killer operating in the area. Detectives from Anchorage made several trips to Portlock during the late 1930s, interviewing residents and examining crime scenes. Their reports, which Jackson obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, painted a picture of a community living in constant terror. Detective William Morrison, who led the investigation, noted in his case files that the killer displayed an intimate knowledge of the victim's routines and habits. The attacks always occurred when people were isolated and vulnerable, often during routine activities like hunting, logging, or fishing. What troubled Morrison most was the complete lack of witnesses or survivors. Despite numerous attacks over nearly a decade, no one had ever seen the killer and lived to describe him. The breakthrough in Jackson's investigation came when he discovered Morrison's personal notes, preserved in a private collection donated to the University of Alaska. The detective had become obsessed with the Portlock case, convinced that he was dealing with something unprecedented in criminal psychology. His notes revealed details that had been carefully omitted from official reports. Morrison described finding evidence of what he termed staging at several crime scenes. Bodies were not simply killed and abandoned, but deliberately arranged and displayed. Personal belongings were often found arranged in neat piles nearby, as if the killer had taken time to go through the victim's possessions. Most disturbing of all were the reports of mutilation that went beyond what would be necessary to kill. Morrison went back to Anchorage in 1940 and never spoke publicly about the case again, Sam told Jackson as they examined the ruins of the old post office. Word was that he'd seen something out there that broke his mind. He retired early and spent his last years in a psychiatric facility, rambling about monsters in the woods. The final wave of killings occurred in the mid-1940s, coinciding with an increase in military activity in Alaska during World War II. Several soldiers stationed at nearby installations went missing while on leave in the Portlock area. Their bodies were found in the same condition as the civilian victims, torn apart with the same surgical precision. By this time, the pattern had become impossible to ignore. The killer was not random or opportunistic, but methodical and patient. He studied his victims, learned their habits, and struck when they were most vulnerable. The level of planning and execution suggested someone with extensive knowledge of the area and its residents. What finally convinced Jackson that he was dealing with a human killer rather than some unknown creature were the small details that emerged from witness interviews. Several residents reported seeing a figure watching them from the tree line, always at a distance, always careful to avoid direct contact. The figure was described as tall and powerfully built, but unmistakably human in its movements and posture. There was a man living out there, Sam said with quiet conviction as they stood in the ruins of what had once been the town's general store. Someone who knew these woods better than anyone. Someone who could move through them like a ghost. The people of Portlock weren't driven out by any monster. They were terrorized by one of their own. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. While researching military records from the 1940s, Jackson discovered reports of a deserter from a nearby army installation who had gone missing in the Portlock area in 1943. The man, whose name was redacted from the records, was described as a survival expert with extensive wilderness training. Search efforts to locate him had been called off after several weeks, and he was presumed dead. But Jackson found evidence suggesting the man had not died, but had instead taken up residence in the vast wilderness surrounding Portlock. Living off the land, he had gradually descended into madness, viewing the townspeople as intruders in his domain. The killings were not random acts of violence, but the methodical elimination of what he saw as threats to his solitary existence. The end came swiftly for Portlock. By 1949, the population had dwindled to fewer than a dozen residents, most of them elderly or unable to leave. The final straw came when the postmaster's assistant, a young woman named Elena Marchetti, vanished while walking to work on a bright morning in September. Her body was found 3 days later, mutilated in the same manner as all the others. Within a week, the remaining residents had packed their belongings and left Portlock forever. The post office closed in 1950, and the town that had once been home to nearly 200 people became a ghost town virtually overnight. The killer had won, driving away everyone who might have threatened his isolated kingdom. Today, Portlock remains abandoned, slowly returning to the wilderness from which it was carved over a century ago. The buildings sag under the weight of decades of rain and snow, their windows staring blindly out at Port Chatham Bay. Nature has begun to reclaim the streets where children once played and families once lived. But sometimes, Sam told Jackson on his final day in the ruins, hikers and hunters still report seeing a figure watching them from the tree line, always at a distance, always careful to remain hidden. The man who destroyed Portlock may be dead now, claimed by age or accident in the unforgiving Alaskan wilderness, but his legacy lives on in the empty houses and silent streets of a town that died not from economic hardship or natural disaster, but from the methodical terror of a human monster who claimed the wilderness as his own. As Jackson packed his notes and prepared to leave Portlock behind, he could not shake the feeling that something was watching him from the dense forest that pressed close against the abandoned buildings. Perhaps it was just his imagination, influenced by days of researching brutal murders and unexplained disappearances. Or perhaps the killer's legacy was more than just empty buildings and forgotten graves. Perhaps somewhere in those endless woods, something still waited and watched, protecting its territory from intruders, just as it had 70 years ago. The fog rolled in from Port Chatham Bay as Jackson drove away from Portlock for the last time, thick and impenetrable, swallowing the ghost town behind him like a shroud. The first night in Kennecott, Khaleesi thought she was dreaming. The sound of metal grinding against metal, rhythmic and mechanical, echoed through the abandoned copper mill as moonlight filtered through broken windows. She sat up in her sleeping bag, straining to listen, but the noise had already faded into the Arctic silence that pressed against the walls of their temporary shelter. 3 months earlier, Khaleesi and her business partner Jay Sion had purchased the restoration rights to the historic 14-story concentration mill that dominated the Kennecott landscape like a red-painted monument to industrial ambition. Their plan was ambitious but simple: restore the mill as a museum and cultural center, capitalizing on the growing tourism in Wrangell St. Elias National Park. What they had not planned for was becoming the unwilling witnesses to a century of unfinished business. Kennecott had been the richest copper mine in the world during its heyday from 1911 to 1938. The massive mill processed millions of dollars worth of copper ore, extracted from 5 mines that tunneled deep into the surrounding mountains. But when the Great Depression hit and copper prices plummeted, the Kennecott Copper Corporation made a brutal decision. Workers were given 2 weeks' notice to pack up their lives and leave forever. The last train out of Kennecott would be the last train ever. The abandonment was so abrupt that families left their dinners on the table, clothes on the line, and children's toys scattered across bedroom floors. For decades, the ghost town sat frozen in time, preserved by the harsh Alaskan climate, and protected by its remote location at the end of the treacherous McCarthy Road. Jason had been skeptical about the local stories of paranormal activity, dismissing them as tourist folklore designed to add mystique to an already remarkable historical site. But by their second week in Kennecott, even he could not deny that something was profoundly wrong with the mill. It started with the sounds. Every night, precisely at midnight, the grinding noise would begin somewhere deep within the mill's machinery. Khaleesi and Jason would investigate with flashlights and headlamps, climbing through the maze of conveyor belts and ore chutes that stretched through all 14 floors of the structure. They never found the source of the noise, but they always found fresh disturbances in the thick dust that coated every surface. Footprints appeared where no one should have been walking. Not their own boots, but the heavy impressions of work boots, the kind worn by miners a century ago. The prints would lead from floor to floor, following the path that ore once took from the railway cars up to the crushing machinery and down to the concentration levels. Sometimes they would find dozens of prints, as if an entire shift of workers had passed through during the night. "We need to document everything," Khaleesi told Jason one morning as they examined a particularly clear set of prints on the 8th floor. "If there's some kind of settling in the building structure that's creating these impressions, we need to understand it before we start major renovation work." But documentation proved difficult. Photographs of the footprints came out blurred or overexposed despite perfect lighting conditions. Video cameras malfunctioned when pointed at the prints, their batteries draining instantly even when fully charged. Most unsettling of all, the prints themselves would fade by morning, leaving only smooth dust as if they had never existed. The first direct encounter occurred during their 3rd week, while they were cataloging equipment on the mill's main processing floor. Khaleesi was examining the massive ore crushers when she heard voices echoing from the level above. Male voices speaking in low tones about production quotas and shift changes. The words were clear enough to understand, but the language had an archaic quality, peppered with mining terminology that had not been used in decades. She called to Jason, who was working 2 floors below, but received no answer. The voices continued growing more animated as they discussed problems with the Bonanza mine tunnel and concerns about a cave-in that had trapped 3 workers. Khaleesi climbed the metal stairs to investigate, but the 9th floor was empty, its machinery covered in undisturbed dust. That night, she researched the Bonanza mine accident the voices had mentioned. According to historical records, 3 miners had indeed been trapped in a tunnel collapse in 1923. Their bodies were never recovered, and the tunnel was sealed permanently. The mine had been located nearly 6 miles up the mountain, accessible only by aerial tramway. There was no logical way that voices discussing that specific accident could be echoing through the mill. Jason remained skeptical until his own encounter 2 days later. He was working alone in the mill's power plant, trying to assess the feasibility of restoring electrical service to the building. The generators had been silent for over 70 years, their massive turbines locked in place by decades of rust and neglect. But as he examined the main turbine, it began to turn. Slowly at first, with the grinding protest of metal that had not moved in generations, the turbine started to rotate. There was no power source, no compressed air, no external force that could have initiated the movement. Yet the massive machine turned with increasing speed, its rhythm matching the processing cycle that had once operated 24 hours a day during the mine's productive years. Jason backed away from the machinery, his heart pounding, as the turbine reached what must have been its operational speed. The mill filled with the sound of industrial production, conveyor belts humming to life, ore crushers grinding through phantom loads of copper-bearing rock. For 10 minutes, the abandoned mill operated exactly as it had during its heyday, processing invisible ore through equipment that should have been immobilized by decades of neglect. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the machinery stopped. The turbines slowed and came to rest, and silence returned to the mill. When Jason examined the equipment, he found that every piece of machinery was exactly as it had been moments before, locked solid by rust and corrosion. The experiences escalated rapidly after that. Both Khaleesi and Jason began to see figures moving through the mill during their workdays. Transparent but distinct, the figures wore the clothing of early 20th century industrial workers. Heavy canvas pants, wool shirts, suspenders, and the distinctive peaked caps favored by mill operators. The figures moved with purpose, tending to machinery that existed only in their ghostly perception, following work routines that had been interrupted by the mine's abrupt closure. Most disturbing were the safety inspections. Every morning, the figures would conduct a thorough examination of the mill's equipment, checking for the mechanical failures and structural weaknesses that had made copper mining one of the most dangerous occupations of the era. They would point at specific locations, discussing hazards in voices that Khaleesi and Jason could barely hear, but somehow understand. Following the ghost workers' safety recommendations, they discovered serious structural problems that their initial engineering survey had missed. Weakened support beams, corroded cable systems, and unstable flooring that could have resulted in serious injuries or death during the restoration work. It was as if the spirits of dead workers were trying to protect the living from making the same mistakes that had cost lives during the mine's operational period. The most profound encounter occurred in the mill's underground levels, where ore cars had once delivered raw copper from the mountain mines. Khaleesi was documenting the rail system when she found herself face to face with a complete mining crew, their forms solid enough to cast shadows in her flashlight beam. The crew was led by a man in his 40s, his face marked by the inevitable copper dust stains that identified longtime mill workers. He spoke directly to Khaleesi, his voice clear and urgent despite the obvious fact that he had been dead for decades. "The Bonanza Tunnel is compromised," he said, pointing toward the mountain where the mine had once operated. "The support timbers are rotting through. If anyone goes in there, the whole section will come down. We never got to warn anyone before they made us leave." The ghost miner explained that his crew had been working the night shift when the mine closure was announced. They had discovered critical structural problems in the main tunnel system, problems that could affect not only the mine but the stability of the entire mountainside. But there had been no time to file proper reports or implement safety measures. The workers were forced to abandon their post, leaving behind dangerous conditions that could claim future lives. "Promise us," the miner said, his ghostly hand reaching toward Khaleesi with desperate urgency. "Promise us you will warn people about the tunnel. We have been trying to tell someone for 80 years. Khaleesi promised, and the figures faded into the mill's shadows, finally at peace. The next day, she and Jason hiked to the Bonanza mine site, following the old aerial tramway route that had once carried ore cars between the mine and the mill. What they found confirmed the ghost miner's warning. The tunnel entrance showed clear signs of recent instability, with fresh rockfall and rotting timber supports that could collapse at any moment. They immediately contacted the National Park Service, which closed access to the mine and began geological surveys to assess the danger to visitors. Within a week, the surveys confirmed that the entire tunnel system was on the verge of catastrophic collapse. A major rock slide was prevented only by the Park Service's rapid response to Khaleesi and Jason's warning. If tourists had continued accessing the mine, the death toll could have been significant. After the mine was secured, the paranormal activity in the mill ceased entirely. The nightly sounds of machinery stopped, the mysterious footprints no longer appeared, and the ghost workers were no longer seen tending to their phantom equipment. It was as if the spirits had been waiting 8 decades for someone to listen to their warnings about the dangerous conditions they had been forced to leave unaddressed. Khaleesi and Jason completed their restoration of the Kennecott Mill, which now serves as both a museum and a memorial to the workers whose dedication extended beyond death. The mill's exhibits include a section dedicated to workplace safety and the miners who sacrificed their lives to extract copper that helped electrify America during its industrial expansion. But sometimes, late at night, when the Arctic wind howls through the mill's metal framework, visitors report hearing the faint sounds of machinery grinding to life and the voices of workers who refuse to abandon their posts, even in death. The ghosts of Kennecott may have found peace, but their presence remains, watching over the mill and the mountain to ensure that the living never have to pay the price for industrial ambition that their generation paid so long ago. The mill still stands today, its red paint faded, but its structure sound, a testament to both human engineering and the supernatural dedication of workers whose shift never truly ended. The McCarthy Road was supposed to be Princeton's final story. After 20 years of covering unexplained phenomena across North America, he had decided that this assignment would mark his retirement from paranormal journalism. The strange lights reported along the 60-mile stretch of unpaved wilderness road seemed like the perfect way to conclude his career, debunking one last mystery before hanging up his camera. Princeton arrived in McCarthy in late September, when the first snows had begun to dust the peaks of the Wrangell Mountains. The town that greeted him was hardly more than a collection of weathered buildings scattered along the Kennecott River, home to fewer than 30 year-round residents. Most were holdouts from Alaska's frontier days, people who had chosen isolation over civilization. They welcomed Princeton with the cautious hospitality that small communities reserve for outsiders. Camden Walsh was one of the few locals willing to discuss the phenomena that had drawn Princeton to McCarthy. A wilderness guide who had spent 15 years leading tourists to the abandoned Kennecott mine, Camden had witnessed the unexplained lights more than anyone else. His accounts were detailed and consistent, lacking the embellishment that Princeton had learned to identify in fabricated stories. It started about 5 years ago, Camden explained, as they sat in the Motherlode Saloon, McCarthy's only bar. First time I saw them, I thought it was just the aurora. But these lights move differently. They follow the road like they're searching for something, or someone. The lights appeared most frequently during the transition between autumn and winter, when the days grew short and the northern lights began their seasonal display. But unlike the aurora borealis, which danced across the entire sky, these lights were localized to the McCarthy Road. They traveled in formation, maintaining a consistent distance above the tree line as they moved from the town toward the Richardson Highway. What made the lights particularly unsettling was their apparent response to human activity. Multiple witnesses described the phenomenon changing course when vehicles approached, circling around cars and trucks before resuming their journey along the road. Some drivers reported their engines stalling when the lights came too close, while others experienced radio interference and electrical malfunctions. Princeton's investigation began with the most recent sighting, reported by a supply truck driver named Marcus Chen. According to Chen's statement, filed with the Alaska State Troopers, he had encountered the lights during a routine delivery run to McCarthy's only general store. The phenomena had appeared just after midnight, emerging from the forest canopy like glowing orbs roughly the size of basketball courts. They moved like they had intelligence, Chen had told investigators. Not random, not like natural phenomena. They were coordinated, like they were working together towards some purpose. Chen's truck had broken down completely when the lights surrounded his vehicle. For nearly an hour he sat helpless as the glowing forms circled above him, occasionally descending close enough to illuminate the interior of his cab. When the lights finally departed, continuing their journey toward the highway, Chen's truck started immediately as if nothing had happened. Princeton interviewed Chen personally and found his account credible. The driver was a 20-year veteran of Alaska's remote supply routes, experienced with every form of weather and natural phenomenon that the state could produce. He had no history of substance abuse, no financial motivation for fabrication, and no interest in publicity. His report was matter-of-fact and detailed, focusing on observable facts rather than speculation about the light's origin or purpose. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Princeton discovered that the light phenomena coincided with a pattern of disappearances along the McCarthy Road. Over the past 5 years, 11 people had vanished while traveling the remote highway. Their vehicles were found abandoned at various points along the route, always with the engines running and personal belongings left behind. The disappearances defied conventional explanation. Search and rescue teams had combed thousands of acres of wilderness without finding any trace of the missing individuals. Cadaver dogs had failed to pick up scent trails. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging had detected no signs of life, and extensive interviews with local residents had produced no witnesses or suspects. Alaska State Trooper Sergeant Maria Santos, who had investigated 7 of the 11 disappearances, agreed to meet with Princeton at the trooper post in Glen Allen. She was reluctant to discuss the cases in detail, but admitted that the investigation had produced no viable leads or theories about what had happened to the missing people. "We've considered every possibility," Santos explained. "Foul play, accidents, people choosing to disappear voluntarily. But there's no evidence supporting any of these theories. It's like these individuals simply ceased to exist the moment they set foot outside their vehicles." The missing persons included tourists, locals, and experienced outdoors enthusiasts who should have been capable of surviving in the Alaskan wilderness. Their ages ranged from 19 to 67, eliminating demographic patterns that might suggest a specific predator or cause. The only common factor was the McCarthy Road itself and the inexplicable decision each person had made to abandon their vehicle and walk into the forest. Princeton spent a week documenting the abandonment sites, looking for clues that the official investigations might have missed. What he found were subtle signs that suggested the missing persons had not left their vehicles voluntarily. Car doors were often found open, but keys remained in ignitions and engines continued running until fuel tanks emptied. Personal items like wallets, cell phones, and medication were left behind, indicating that the departures had been sudden and unplanned. Most disturbing were the objects that Princeton discovered near several abandonment sites. Carved wooden totems, roughly humanoid in shape, hung from tree branches along the road. The carvings were crude but deliberately placed, marking specific locations with what appeared to be symbolic significance. Local residents claimed no knowledge of the totems, and their weathered condition suggested they had been in place for years. Camden accompanied Princeton during his investigation of the totem sites, bringing along his rifle and emergency supplies. As they examined the carved figures, both men began to experience a profound sense of unease that seemed to emanate from the forest itself. The normal sounds of wildlife ceased, replaced by an oppressive silence that made their voices sound unnaturally loud. "Something's watching us," Camden whispered as they documented one of the totems with Princeton's camera. "I've been in these woods my whole life, and I've never felt anything like this." The sensation of being observed intensified as they moved from site to site. Princeton, despite his years of investigating supposedly haunted locations, found himself constantly looking over his shoulder and fighting the urge to abandon his documentation and flee. The totems seemed to be arranged in a pattern that followed the road, creating a corridor of marked territory that extended from McCarthy to the highway junction. On their third day of investigation, Princeton and Camden discovered what appeared to be a camp hidden deep in the forest, approximately 2 miles from one of the abandonment sites. The camp consisted of a ring of stones arranged around a fire pit, with additional totems positioned at cardinal points around the perimeter. Personal items were scattered throughout the area: clothing, identification cards, jewelry, and other belongings that clearly belonged to multiple individuals. Among the scattered possessions, Princeton recognized several items that matched descriptions from missing persons reports. A distinctive turquoise bracelet belonged to Sarah Martinez, a photographer who had disappeared 3 years earlier. A leather wallet contained the driver's license of David Kowalski, a tourist from Wisconsin who had vanished the previous spring. Most chilling of all was a collection of car keys hanging from a rope stretched between 2 trees, each set labeled with dates that corresponded to the documented disappearances. The discovery suggested that someone or something had been collecting trophies from the missing persons, creating a shrine that commemorated each disappearance. But the camp showed no signs of recent habitation. The fire pit was cold and filled with debris. The totems were weathered by months of exposure, and the scattered belongings had been damaged by animals and weather. Princeton photographed everything, creating a detailed record of the camp's contents. But when he attempted to review the images later that evening, he discovered that his camera had malfunctioned. Every photograph taken at the campsite was corrupted, showing only static or strange geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. The malfunction was isolated to those specific images. Photographs taken before and after the camp discovery were perfectly normal. That night, the lights returned with unprecedented intensity. Princeton and Camden witnessed the phenomena from their rooms at McCarthy Lodge, watching as dozens of glowing orbs moved in formation along the road. The lights pulsed with different colors: blue, green, white, and deep red, creating patterns that seemed almost like a language or code. During the display, both men experienced vivid waking visions that felt more real than dreams. They saw the missing persons walking along the McCarthy Road in single file, their movements mechanical and purposeless. The people appeared translucent but recognizable, still wearing the clothes they had been last seen in. They walked without looking back, following a path that led deep into the wilderness toward destinations unknown. The visions lasted until dawn, when the lights finally faded with the rising sun. Princeton and Camden compared their experiences and found that they had shared identical images, seeing the same procession of missing persons walking the same route into the forest. Neither man could explain how they had experienced synchronized visions, but both were convinced that what they had seen represented some form of truth about the disappeared. The final piece of the mystery emerged during Princeton's last day in McCarthy. While interviewing elderly residents about the area's history, he learned about a Native American legend concerning the road's location. According to traditional stories, the corridor now occupied by the McCarthy Road was once a spirit path, used by the dead to travel from the world of the living to whatever lay beyond. The construction of the road in 1974 had disrupted this ancient pathway, trapping spirits who could no longer complete their journey. The lights were the manifestation of these trapped souls, searching endlessly for a way to continue their passage to the afterlife. The missing persons were not victims of violence or accident, but individuals who had been chosen to guide the spirits along their interrupted path. The road cut through sacred ground, explained Agnes Katina, the tribe's eldest member. When you build on a spirit path, you become part of it. Some people are called to help the dead find their way. They don't come back because their work isn't finished. Princeton left McCarthy with more questions than answers, but with a profound respect for mysteries that defied conventional explanation. His planned debunking had become an encounter with forces beyond his understanding. The lights continued to appear along the McCarthy Road, and people continued to disappear. But perhaps, as Agnes Chitina suggested, they were not disappearing at all. Perhaps they were fulfilling a purpose that the living could never fully comprehend. The McCarthy Road remains open today, carrying tourists and supplies to one of Alaska's most remote communities. But those who travel it at night sometimes report seeing lights moving through the forest, and occasionally transparent figures walking along the roadside toward destinations that exist beyond the boundaries of the known world. Princeton never published his final story. Some mysteries, he realized, were meant to remain unsolved. The wind off the Lynn Canal carried the scent of decay as Braylon Martinez stepped off the small charter boat onto the rocky shore of Daya. What had once been the gateway to the Klondike Gold Rush was now little more than scattered foundation stones and rusted metal fragments hidden beneath decades of overgrowth. The ghosts of 30,000 fortune seekers who had passed through this desolate beach between 1897 and 1899 seemed to whisper in the constant Arctic breeze. Braylon had come to Daya not as a tourist seeking gold rush history, but as a criminal investigator, following a trail of evidence that connected 11 unsolved disappearances spanning over 40 years. Each case shared the same disturbing pattern: experienced hikers and researchers who had come to explore the historic Chilkoot Trail, only to vanish without explanation along the treacherous route that had once claimed the lives of countless prospectors seeking their fortunes in the Yukon Territory. The most recent disappearance had occurred just 3 months earlier. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a respected archaeologist from the University of Washington, had been conducting research on gold rush artifacts along the lower portion of the Chilkoot Trail. Her abandoned campsite was discovered by park rangers after she failed to check in at the scheduled time. Her research notes, camping equipment, and personal belongings were found undisturbed. But Dr. Vasquez herself had vanished as completely as if she had never existed. What made this case particularly intriguing to Braylon was the discovery of Royalty Chen's journal among Dr. Vasquez's possessions. Royalty had been a graduate student working as Dr. Vasquez's research assistant, and her detailed journal entries provided a chilling account of the weeks leading up to both their disappearances. The journal had been overlooked by the initial investigation, classified as routine academic notes rather than potential evidence in a criminal case. Braylon spent his first day in Daya reading through Royalty's journal, searching for clues that might explain what had happened to both women. What he found was a methodical documentation of increasingly disturbing discoveries along the Chilkoot Trail, evidence of something far more sinister than the harsh natural conditions that had historically made the route so dangerous. According to Royalty's entries, the research team had initially been focused on cataloging artifacts left behind by gold rush stampeders. The Canadian government had required each prospector to carry a year's worth of supplies, approximately 2,000 pounds of goods, over the Chilkoot Pass. Many had been forced to abandon equipment along the trail, creating an archaeological treasure trove that had been preserved by the harsh Arctic climate. But Royalty's journal revealed that they had discovered artifacts that predated the gold rush by decades, possibly centuries. Carved bone tools, primitive weapons, and ritualistic objects that suggested the Chilkoot Trail had been used for purposes far darker than gold prospecting. Most disturbing were the human remains that had been partially excavated from various sites along the trail, remains that showed evidence of systematic violence. Day 12, Royalty had written in her precise academic script. Found another burial site today, approximately 2 miles up from Sheep Camp. This makes 7 sites total. Dr. Vasquez is convinced we're looking at evidence of organized killings, not individual murders or accidents. The positioning of the remains suggests the victims were forced to kneel before being killed with blunt instruments. All show evidence of skull trauma consistent with heavy stone or metal weapons. The journal entries became increasingly urgent as the research progressed. Royalty documented finding carved symbols along the trail, petroglyphs that matched no known Native American artistic tradition. The symbols appeared to mark specific locations where human remains had been discovered, creating a map of violence that stretched along the entire 33-mile length of the Chilkoot Trail. Day 18, the journal continued. Dr. Vasquez believes we've stumbled onto evidence of a serial killer who operated during the gold rush period. Someone who used the chaos and desperation of the stampede to prey on isolated prospectors. The remote location and harsh conditions would have made it easy to kill without witnesses, and the constant stream of transients meant victims might not be missed for weeks or months. Braylon's investigation took on new urgency when he realized that Royalty's research had identified the same pattern of violence that characterized the modern disappearances. Each of the 11 missing persons had been found to have camping gear or abandoned vehicles at locations that corresponded to the ancient burial sites marked in Royalty's journal. The killer who had terrorized gold rush prospectors appeared to have returned, or perhaps had never stopped hunting along the Chilkoot Trail. The breakthrough came when Braylon discovered that Royalty had been conducting research beyond what was documented in her official academic work. Hidden in the back pages of her journal were personal observations and theories that painted a picture of ongoing criminal activity along the trail. She had identified a pattern of recent disappearances that matched the historical killings, and had begun to suspect that someone was deliberately targeting researchers and hikers who might discover evidence of the old murders. Day 22, her final entry read, "I think we're being watched. Found fresh footprints around our camp this morning, boots not hiking shoes. Someone has been observing our work. Dr. Vasquez wants to contact the authorities, but I convinced her to gather more evidence first. If we're right about this, we need proof that will stand up in court. But I'm scared. The person doing this has been getting away with murder for over a century. They won't hesitate to kill again to protect their secret." Braylon spent the next 3 days retracing the route that Royalty and Dr. Vasquez had followed during their final week of research. What he found confirmed his worst fears about the case. The archaeological sites had been deliberately disturbed after the women's disappearance, with evidence removed or destroyed to eliminate any proof of the historical killings. Someone with detailed knowledge of the research had systematically covered up the crime scenes. More disturbing was the discovery of recent additions to the ancient burial sites. Fresh human remains, partially concealed but clearly recent, had been added to several of the locations that Royalty had documented. The modern victims had been killed with the same methods used on the Gold Rush era victims, their skulls crushed with heavy blunt instruments, and their bodies positioned in the same ritualistic manner. The killer was not just continuing a century-old murder spree, but was actively maintaining the burial sites as some form of twisted memorial to their crimes. Each new victim was added to the collection, preserving a legacy of violence that stretched back to the height of the Klondike Gold Rush. Braylon's investigation led him to examine the few permanent residents of the Skagway area who had access to the remote sections of the Chilkoot Trail. The killer would need to be someone with intimate knowledge of the trail's history and geography, someone who could move freely through the area without arousing suspicion. Most importantly, they would need to be someone who had been present in the area for decades, possibly their entire life. The evidence pointed to Marcus Thornfield, a 73-year-old historian and trail guide who had been leading hiking expeditions along the Chilkoot Trail for over 50 years. Thornfield's family had deep roots in the Skagway area, with ancestors who had operated supply businesses during the gold rush. He possessed extensive knowledge of trail history and had unlimited access to the remote areas where the murders had occurred. More damning was the discovery that Thornfield had been present in the area during every one of the 11 modern disappearances. His guide service records showed that he had been leading groups along the trail within days of each person going missing. In several cases, the missing individuals had specifically hired Thornfield's company for private guided tours of the historical sites. Braylon's investigation revealed that Thornfield had been systematically identifying and targeting researchers and serious hikers who showed interest in the archaeological aspects of the Chilkoot Trail. Anyone who might discover evidence of the historical murders was marked for elimination. Their disappearance explained as another tragic accident in the unforgiving Alaskan wilderness. The pattern extended back to Thornfield's youth, when he had first learned about the burial sites from his grandfather, who had been one of the original killers during the gold rush period. The Thornfield family had been preying on isolated prospectors for over a century, passing down the locations of the burial sites and the methods of murder from generation to generation. Confronting Thornfield required careful planning, as the elderly guide was still physically capable and had decades of experience navigating the dangerous terrain of the Chilkoot Trail. Braylon coordinated with Alaska state troopers and park rangers to establish surveillance and gather additional evidence before making an arrest. The confrontation occurred at Sheep Camp, the historic resting point where thousands of gold rush stampeders had prepared for the final assault on Chilkoot Pass. Thornfield had agreed to meet with Braylon under the pretense of discussing historical research, unaware that his movements were being monitored by hidden law enforcement personnel. When presented with evidence of his crimes, Thornfield showed no remorse or surprise. He calmly explained that he was continuing a family tradition that had been protecting the real history of the Chilkoot Trail for over a century. The murders were not random acts of violence, but a deliberate effort to prevent the truth about his family's role in gold rush-era crimes from being exposed. "People come up here looking for gold rush romance," Thornfield said, as handcuffs were placed on his wrists. "They don't want to know about what really happened. My great-grandfather and grandfather made a good living off desperate men who would never be missed. I've just been making sure their legacy stays buried where it belongs." The arrest of Marcus Thornfield solved 11 missing persons cases and provided closure for families who had waited decades for answers about their lost loved ones. The discovery of the burial sites also rewrote the historical record of the Klondike Gold Rush, revealing a dark chapter of systematic murder that had been hidden for over a century. Royalty, Chen's journal proved instrumental in solving the case, her academic research providing the key evidence needed to identify the pattern of killings and connect them to the modern disappearances. Dr. Elena Vasquez's body was recovered from one of the burial sites, finally allowing her family to lay her to rest with dignity. The Chilkoot Trail remains open to hikers and researchers, but with increased security measures and regular patrol by park rangers. The burial sites discovered by Royalty's research have been properly excavated, and the victims given appropriate burial, finally ending over a century of violence along the trail that had once represented hope and opportunity to thousands of gold rush stampeders. Braylon's investigation into the Daya disappearances became a landmark case in criminal archaeology, demonstrating how historical research could be used to solve modern crimes. But it also served as a reminder that some family secrets run so deep and dark that they span generations, creating legacies of violence that can persist for over a century before finally being brought to light. The wind still carries the scent of decay along the shores of Daya, but now it speaks not of ancient mysteries, but of justice finally served to victims whose stories had been buried beneath decades of silence and snow. The temperature had dropped to 30 below zero when Jason Pierce first heard the footsteps echoing through the abandoned streets of Chinahat Springs. What made the sound so unsettling was not just its clarity in the brittle Arctic air, but the fact that he could see his own breath-forming clouds while the footsteps belonged to no visible person. The ghost town that had once thrived as a mining settlement during Alaska's early territorial period now served as a frozen monument to dreams that had died in the unforgiving wilderness. Jason had come to China as part of a paranormal investigation team hired by the Alaska Historical Society to document reported supernatural activity in several of the state's abandoned settlements. His partner, Jackson Miller, was a skeptical photographer whose job was to provide visual evidence of any phenomena they encountered. Neither man believed they would find anything more than the usual tricks of wind and shadow that often explained away ghost stories. They were wrong. Chena Hot Springs had been established in 1905 when Felix Pedro discovered gold in the surrounding hills, triggering a rush that brought thousands of prospectors to the remote valley. The natural hot springs that gave the area its name provided a rare source of warmth in the harsh interior Alaska climate, making the location ideal for a permanent settlement. At its peak, Chena had supported over 3,000 residents, complete with hotels, saloons, a newspaper, and all the amenities of a thriving frontier community. But the gold played out faster than anyone had expected. By 1915, most of the easily accessible ore had been extracted, and the cost of deeper mining operations made continued extraction unprofitable. The Great Depression delivered the final blow, forcing the last residents to abandon their homes and businesses in search of opportunities elsewhere. By 1940, Chena had become a ghost town, its buildings left to the mercy of the elements and the passage of time. What drew paranormal investigators to Chena was not just its abandonment, but the unusually high number of deaths that had occurred during the settlement's brief existence. Mining accidents, violent crimes, and the harsh climate had claimed over 200 lives during the town's 35-year lifespan. Many of the dead had been buried in the permafrost surrounding the town, their graves marked only by crude, wooden crosses that had long since rotted away or been buried by decades of snow. Jason and Jackson set up their equipment in what had once been the Chena Hotel, the town's largest building and one of the few structures that remained partially intact. The hotel's lobby still contained fragments of its original furnishings, including a registration desk and the skeletal remains of a grand staircase that had once led to guest rooms on the upper floors. Ice coated every surface, creating an otherworldly landscape of frozen decay. The first manifestation occurred on their second night in the hotel. Jason was monitoring electronic voice phenomenon equipment in the lobby when he began to hear what sounded like conversations coming from the upper floors. Male voices speaking in low tones, discussing mining claims and supply shipments with the casual familiarity of regular guests. The voices were clear enough to understand individual words, but when Jason climbed the deteriorating staircase to investigate, the second floor was empty and silent. Jackson initially dismissed the voices as audio pareidolia, the tendency of the human brain to interpret random sounds as familiar patterns like speech. But when they reviewed the digital recordings the next morning, the voices were clearly audible on the audio equipment, ruling out psychological explanation. More disturbing was the fact that the conversations included specific references to mining operations and local businesses that matched historical records of Chena's commercial activity during its peak years. The phenomena escalated rapidly after that first encounter. Both men began to experience sudden drops in temperature that were localized to specific areas of the hotel, creating cold spots that were 20 or 30 degrees colder than the surrounding air. These temperature anomalies moved through the building in patterns that suggested the presence of multiple invisible entities, each carrying their own zone of supernatural cold. Most unsettling were the footsteps that had first drawn Jason's attention. Every night, beginning precisely at midnight, the sound of boots walking across wooden floors echoed through the hotel. The footsteps followed specific routes through the building, climbing the staircase to the second floor, walking the length of the hallway, and descending back to the lobby. Multiple sets of footsteps often overlapped, creating the impression of several people moving through the building simultaneously. Jackson's photographic equipment began capturing anomalies that defied conventional explanation. Digital cameras recorded shadow figures moving through rooms where no one was present, transparent forms that appeared solid enough to cast reflections in the ice-covered windows. Most remarkable were the images that showed the hotel as it had appeared during its operational years, complete with period furnishings and decorations that had long since been destroyed or removed. "Look at this," Jackson said, showing Jason a series of photographs taken in the hotel lobby. These were shot 5 minutes apart, same camera position, same lighting conditions, The first photograph showed the lobby as they had found it, empty and deteriorated, but the subsequent images revealed gradual changes that transformed the space. Furniture materialized in the frame, including chairs and tables that matched descriptions from historical accounts of the hotel's original decor. Gas lamps flickered to life on the walls, casting warm light that eliminated the modern shadows created by their equipment. The registration desk appeared fully stocked with ledgers and keys, as if ready to accommodate arriving guests. The final photograph in the sequence showed the lobby populated with translucent figures dressed in early 20th century clothing. Men in wool coats and mining gear stood near the registration desk, their forms solid enough to be clearly visible, but transparent enough that the modern decay of the room was still visible through their bodies. They appeared to be checking in for rooms, conducting business with a desk clerk who was invisible in the photograph, but whose presence was implied by their gestures and posture. "It's like they're trapped in some kind of loop," Jason observed, studying the images, repeating the same activities they performed when they were alive, unaware that the hotel has been abandoned for decades. The breakthrough in understanding the phenomena came when they discovered that the supernatural activity followed a specific schedule that matched historical records of the hotel's daily operations. The footsteps occurred during the hours when guests would have been retiring to their rooms or leaving for early mining shifts. The voices in the upper floors corresponded to mealtimes when travelers would have gathered in the dining room. Even the temperature anomalies followed patterns that suggested the presence of residents going about their normal routines. Research into the hotel's records revealed that many of the guests who had stayed at the Chena Hotel during its operational years had died while in residence. Some had succumbed to mining accidents, others to disease or violence, and a significant number had simply disappeared into the wilderness, never to be seen again. The hotel had served as a temporary home for hundreds of people whose lives had been cut short before they could achieve their dreams of striking it rich in the Alaskan goldfields. The most profound encounter occurred during their final night in Chena. Jason was conducting a solo EVP session in the hotel's dining room when he became aware of a presence seated at the table across from him. The chair, which had been empty moments before, now supported the weight of an invisible occupant. The ancient wooden seat creaked softly as the unseen figure shifted position, and Jason could hear the faint sound of breathing in the frigid air. "Who are you?" Jason asked, his voice barely above a whisper in the profound silence of the abandoned building. The response came not as words, but as a sudden flood of sensory impressions that filled Jason's consciousness. He experienced the memories of a man named Thomas Morrison, a prospector from Seattle who had come to Chena in 1912 with dreams of finding enough gold to bring his wife and children to Alaska. Morrison had taken a room at the hotel while establishing his mining claim, planning to stay only a few weeks before building a cabin on his property. But Morrison's luck had run out on a bitter February morning when a tunnel collapse trapped him 300 feet underground. His body was never recovered, and his family back in Seattle never learned what had happened to him. For over a century, Morrison's spirit had remained in the hotel where he had felt most at home, waiting for news of his mining claim and hoping to send word to his family that he was still alive. Through Morrison's memories, Jason experienced the stories of dozens of other spirits who remained trapped in the abandoned hotel. Each had died with unfinished business, dreams unfulfilled, or loved ones left behind without explanation. The hotel had become a gathering place for the lost souls of Chena's gold rush era, spirits who continued to seek the prosperity and happiness that had brought them to Alaska but had been denied to them by death. The encounter lasted only minutes, but it left Jason with a profound understanding of the supernatural activity they had documented. The ghosts of Chena were not malevolent entities seeking to harm the living, but lost souls trapped between worlds by the intensity of their unfulfilled desires. They continued to live out their earthly routines because they could not accept that their dreams had died with their bodies. On their final morning in Chena, Jason and Jackson discovered that their presence had somehow provided closure for at least some of the trapped spirits. The temperature anomalies had ceased, the footsteps no longer echoed through the hotel corridors, and the photographic equipment no longer captured images of supernatural activity. It was as if bearing witness to their stories had allowed some of the ghosts to finally find peace and move on to whatever lay beyond their earthly existence. But not all of the spirits had departed. As they packed their equipment and prepared to leave Chena, both men heard a final set of footsteps climbing the hotel staircase. The sound was different from the previous manifestations, slower and more deliberate, carrying an unmistakable sense of gratitude. Someone or something was acknowledging their efforts to document the forgotten stories of Chena's lost residents. The investigation of Chena Hot Springs became one of the most compelling cases in paranormal research, providing clear evidence of intelligent supernatural activity while revealing the human stories behind the phenomena. The Alaska Historical Society used Jason and Jackson's documentation to create a memorial display honoring the forgotten residents of Chena, ensuring that their names and stories would not be lost to history. Today, Chena Hot Springs operates as a resort, drawing visitors to experience the natural thermal pools that first attracted settlers over a century ago. But the old ghost town remains largely abandoned, its crumbling buildings slowly disappearing beneath the encroaching wilderness. Sometimes, guests at the modern resort report hearing footsteps or voices coming from the direction of the abandoned settlement, particularly on cold winter nights when the aurora borealis dances across the sky above the Chena River Valley. The spirits of Chena may have found peace, but their stories remain as a reminder of the dreams and tragedies that shaped Alaska's frontier history. In the frigid darkness of the interior Alaska winter, the past and present converge in ways that challenge our understanding of life, death, and the persistence of human consciousness beyond the grave. The radio crackled to life at 3 a.m, cutting through the silence of the abandoned Gold King mine with a transmission that should have been impossible. Ja'Kai Morrison jolted awake in his sleeping bag, straining to hear the distorted voice that emerged from the decades-old mining communication equipment they had discovered in the foreman's office. The voice spoke in the clipped professional tone of a shift supervisor reporting on production quotas and safety conditions, as if the mine were still in full operation after being closed for over 60 years. Ja'Kai and his mining survey team had arrived at the Gold King mine 3 days earlier, hired by a Vancouver-based resource company to assess the feasibility of reopening the remote gold extraction facility in the Chugach Mountains. The mine had operated from 1942 to 1963, producing over 2 million ounces of gold before a combination of depleted ore reserves and prohibitive transportation costs forced its closure. What the company had not told them was why 3 previous survey teams had abandoned their assessments without filing complete reports. The mine's infrastructure remained remarkably preserved thanks to Alaska's dry mountain climate and its isolation from vandalism or development. The main shaft descended 800 feet into the mountainside, supported by timber frameworks that had withstood decades of freeze-thaw cycles. The surface facilities included a mill building, assay office, equipment storage, and worker housing that appeared as if the miners had simply walked away from their jobs one day and never returned. Khaleesi Chen, the team's geologist and Ja'Kai's longtime colleague, had been monitoring seismic equipment in the mill building when the radio transmission began. She arrived at the foreman's office just as the voice was signing off, using mining terminology and shift codes that matched the operational procedures documented in the mine's archived records. But the radio equipment itself had not been connected to any power source for decades. And even if it had been functional, there were no active mining operations within hundreds of miles that could account for the transmission. "Did you record that?" Ja'Kai asked, checking his digital audio equipment. The recording devices showed no activity during the time they had heard the transmission, as if the sound had existed only within the confines of the mine itself. The phenomenon escalated over the following days as their survey work progressed deeper into the mine complex. Equipment malfunctions became routine, with modern electronic instruments failing in ways that defied technical explanation. GPS units lost satellite signals while underground, which was normal, but they also malfunctioned when used on the surface. Digital cameras produced images that were overexposed or completely black, despite perfect lighting conditions. Most unsettling of all, their mining equipment seemed to operate with a will of its own. The diesel generator that powered their lights and equipment would surge and dim without warning, creating fluctuations that followed no mechanical pattern. Core drilling equipment would start and stop independently, boring holes in locations that the team had not selected. Even their hand tools seemed affected, with metal instruments becoming unnaturally cold to the touch and exhibiting magnetic properties that interfered with their compass readings. The breakthrough came when Khaleesi discovered that the mysterious phenomena followed the schedule of the mine's final operational shift in November 1963. According to the mine's closure documentation, the last crew had been working a night shift when they received orders to cease operations immediately and evacuate the facility. The radio transmissions, equipment malfunctions, and other anomalies occurred at the exact times that would correspond to that final shift's work routine. "It's like they never got the message," Khaleesi observed, as they compared the timing of the phenomena to historical work schedules. Something is still down there, following the same patterns they would have been following on the night the mine closed. The discovery of personal belongings in the deeper sections of the mine suggested a more sinister explanation for the supernatural activity. The survey team found equipment and personal items that belonged to miners who should have evacuated with the rest of the crew in 1963. Lunch pails, work gloves, and even identification badges were scattered throughout the lower tunnels, as if their owners had abandoned them in haste or panic. Most disturbing was the discovery of a complete mining crew's worth of equipment in a section of the mine that had been sealed off since the closure. The seal showed no signs of being disturbed, yet inside the chamber were tools, helmets, and other gear belonging to 5 miners whose names appeared on the final shift roster. According to the company records, all personnel had been successfully evacuated and accounted for during the mine's closure, but the evidence suggested that at least some of the final crew had never left the facility. The mystery deepened when Jakai's research into the mine's closure revealed discrepancies in the official records. The Vancouver company that had owned the Gold King mine had reported a routine shutdown due to economic factors, but newspaper archives from the period contained references to unexplained incidents and safety concerns that had precipitated the sudden closure. Several miners from the final shift had been treated at the Anchorage hospital for what were described as exposure-related injuries, despite the fact that the November weather had been unusually mild for the season. Local residents from the nearby town of Chicken Creek, interviewed by phone, provided fragments of a story that had been suppressed for decades. They remembered the night in November 1963 when emergency vehicles had raced toward the Gold King mine, followed by a convoy of company officials and what appeared to be federal investigators. The mine had been sealed within days, and company representatives had paid generous settlements to local residents in exchange for confidentiality agreements about anything they might have seen or heard. "My father worked there for 15 years, one elderly resident told Jakai during a phone interview. He never talked about what happened that last night, but he had nightmares for years afterward. Used to wake up screaming about being trapped underground, about voices calling for help that nobody could reach. The phenomena affecting Jakai's survey team intensified as they worked deeper into the mine complex. The radio transmissions became more frequent and urgent, with voices reporting equipment failures, structural collapses, and crew members who were missing or injured. The voices used names that matched personnel records from the final shift, suggesting that the transmissions represented some form of psychic imprint of the mine's last night of operation. Most unsettling were the reports of cave-ins and gas leaks that the phantom radio voices described, because the survey team's structural analysis showed no evidence of major collapses or dangerous gas concentrations in the mine. Whatever catastrophe had occurred during that final shift in 1963, it had left no physical trace in the mine's structure. The disaster existed only in the supernatural echo of voices that continued to report emergencies that could no longer be verified or addressed. The climax of their investigation occurred when Khaleesi descended alone into the lowest accessible level of the mine to collect rock samples for mineral analysis. She was working in a narrow tunnel when the lights failed, plunging her into absolute darkness 800 feet underground. In the silence that followed, she heard the voices of the trapped miners calling for help, their words echoing through tunnels that should have been empty. "Section 7 is flooding," one voice called out clearly. "We need emergency pumps down here now." "The timber supports are failing in the main shaft," reported another. "Evacuate all personnel from levels 4 through 8. "Can anyone hear us?" came a third voice, filled with desperation. "We're trapped behind the collapse." "There are 5 of us here. Please, if anyone can hear this, send help." Khaleesi realized that she was experiencing a supernatural replay of the mine's final night, when some form of disaster had trapped part of the crew underground. The voices she heard belonged to the miners whose equipment they had found in the sealed chamber, crew members who had died during the catastrophic events that forced the mine's closure, but whose deaths had been covered up to avoid federal investigation and liability claims. When her lights flickered back to life, Khaleesi found herself surrounded by evidence of the trapped miners' final moments. Fresh scratch marks on the tunnel walls showed where they had tried to dig their way out, and their names were carved into the rock along with desperate messages to their families. The supernatural activity in the Gold King mine was not random phenomena, but the psychic residue of 5 men who had died alone in the darkness, their sacrifice covered up, and their families never told the truth about their fate. Jakai's survey team evacuated the mine immediately, but not before documenting their findings and collecting evidence of the cover-up that had hidden the truth for over 60 years. Their report to the Vancouver company included not only their geological assessment, but also their recommendation that the mine be treated as a burial site rather than a resource extraction facility. The 5 miners who had died during the final shift deserved proper recognition and burial, not continued exploitation of the site where they had lost their lives. The company quietly abandoned their plans to reopen the Gold King mine, citing unexpected regulatory complications that made the project economically unfeasible. But Jakai and Khaleesi's documentation of the supernatural phenomena and historical cover-up eventually reached the families of the trapped miners, providing closure for relatives who had spent decades wondering about the circumstances of their loved ones' deaths. Today, the Gold King mine remains sealed, its tunnels and surface facilities slowly deteriorating under the weight of time and weather. But sometimes, especially during the long winter nights when the wind howls through the Chugach Mountains, local residents report hearing the faint sound of radio transmissions echoing from the direction of the abandoned mine. The voices continue to call for help, reporting emergencies that occurred over 60 years ago, seeking rescue that will never come. The supernatural activity serves as a reminder that some corporate secrets are too terrible to remain buried, and that the dead will continue to demand justice until their stories are finally heard and acknowledged. The Gold King mine may be closed forever, but the voices of the miners who died there continue to speak, ensuring that their sacrifice and the truth about their fate will not be forgotten by history. In the end, the real treasure hidden in the Gold King mine was not gold, but the untold story of 5 men whose lives were deemed expendable in the pursuit of profit, and whose spirits refused to rest until their deaths were finally acknowledged and their families given the closure they deserved. The diving helmet emerged from the flooded mine shaft like a relic from a forgotten nightmare, its brass surface corroded green with decades of submersion. Royalty, Washington had been documenting the Treadwell mine ruins for her maritime archaeology thesis when the helmet broke the surface of the dark water, carried by currents that should not have existed in the sealed underground chambers. What made the discovery truly unsettling was the fact that someone appeared to be wearing it. Treadwell had once been the largest hard rock gold mine in the world, a sprawling industrial complex on Douglas Island that employed over 2,000 workers at its peak in the early 1900s. The town built around the mine had boasted Alaska's first swimming pool, electric lights, and even a baseball team that competed against teams from Seattle. But on April 21st, 1917, disaster struck when unsafe mining practices and an unusually high tide combined to flood 3 of the 4 major mine shafts in a matter of hours. The collapse had been catastrophic, but remarkably free of human casualties. Workers had evacuated safely when the tunnel supports began failing, and only equipment and livestock were lost when millions of gallons of seawater rushed into the underground chambers. Or so the official records claimed. Royalty's research into the disaster had uncovered discrepancies that suggested the death toll might have been higher than reported, with several miners listed as missing rather than confirmed safe. Sam Rodriguez, a technical diver and underwater photographer, had volunteered to help Royalty explore the flooded sections of the mine that were accessible through collapsed surface openings. The water in the shafts was crystal clear despite its depth, preserved by the cold temperature and lack of organic material in the sealed chambers. Visibility extended for dozens of feet in all directions, creating an underwater landscape that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. The diving equipment they discovered should not have been there. The helmet that had startled Royalty was attached to a complete atmospheric diving suit of a design that predated the mine disaster by several decades. The suit was positioned near the bottom of the main shaft, standing upright as if the diver were still alive and exploring the flooded tunnels. But when Sam descended to investigate, he found that the suit was empty, its brass fittings sealed but containing nothing but dark water. More suits were discovered as they explored deeper into the flooded mine complex. Each was positioned in a different location, standing or kneeling among the submerged mining equipment as if the divers were conducting some form of underwater survey. The suits showed varying degrees of age and corrosion, suggesting they had been placed in the mine over a period of many years. Some bore manufacturing marks that dated them to the 1890s, while others appeared to be from the 1920s or later. The discovery that changed everything came when Sam found a diving suit that contained human remains. The skeleton inside was perfectly preserved by the cold, mineral-rich water, still articulating within the confines of the atmospheric suit. Personal effects found in the suit's pockets identified the remains as those of Marcus Brennan, a professional salvage diver who had been hired to recover equipment from the flooded mine in 1923. According to newspaper archives, Brennan had been working alone when his surface support team lost contact with him during a routine salvage operation. His body was never recovered, and the salvage company had claimed that equipment failure had probably trapped him in an inaccessible section of the mine. But the location where Sam found Brennan's remains was easily accessible from the surface, raising questions about why the original search effort had failed to locate him. The implications became more disturbing as Royalty researched the backgrounds of other divers who had worked in the Treadwell mine over the years. At least 12 professional divers had been reported missing or killed while working in the flooded shafts between 1918 and 1942, when salvage operations were finally abandoned as too dangerous. In each case, the official explanation involved equipment failure or navigation errors that prevented the recovery of the diver's body. But the underwater suits Sam had discovered suggested a different explanation. The divers had not been killed by accidents or equipment failures, but had been deliberately trapped in the mine by someone or something that wanted to preserve them as permanent residents of the flooded chambers. Each suit had been positioned with care, creating an underwater memorial to the men who had died trying to salvage treasure from the collapsed mine. The paranormal activity began during their third dive into the main shaft. Sam was photographing the arranged diving suits when he noticed movement in his peripheral vision. A figure in an old-style diving helmet was walking across the bottom of the flooded chamber, moving with the slow, deliberate pace of someone working underwater. The figure appeared solid and real, casting shadows in Sam's underwater lights and disturbing sediment as it moved. But when Sam approached the walking figure, it vanished, leaving only an undisturbed layer of silt on the mine floor. The photographs he had taken showed empty water where the figure had been clearly visible moments before. The diving suit that had been moving was found in its original position, exactly as they had discovered it days earlier. Royalty experienced her own encounter while reviewing underwater footage on the surface. The video clearly showed multiple figures moving through the flooded mine, all wearing different styles of atmospheric diving suits from various historical periods. The figures moved with purpose, examining mining equipment and collecting artifacts as if they were conducting their own salvage operations. But when she played the footage back, the figures were gone, leaving only empty shots of the underwater chambers. The supernatural activity escalated when they discovered the source of the current that had brought the first diving helmet to the surface. Deep in the flooded mine, water was flowing through passages that should have been sealed by the original collapse. The current originated from a section of the mine that had never been mapped, extending far deeper into the mountain than the original excavations should have reached. Following the current led them to a vast underwater cavern that appeared to be natural rather than excavated. The cavern contained dozens of additional diving suits, arranged in rows like soldiers standing at attention. Some of the suits were so old that they predated the mine disaster by decades, suggesting that divers had been disappearing in this location long before the tunnels were flooded. At the center of the cavern stood a figure that was different from the others. This diving suit was massive, easily twice the size of the historical atmospheric suits, and appeared to be occupied by something that was not entirely human. The figure moved when they approached, turning to face them with deliberate intelligence. Through the helmet's viewing port, they could see what appeared to be a human face, but distorted by decades of submersion into something barely recognizable. The entity spoke to them through vibrations in the water, words that they felt rather than heard. It identified itself as the foreman of the original mining operation, a man named Thomas McReady, who had supervised the deepest excavations before the disaster. McReady claimed that he had discovered something in the deepest tunnels, something that had been buried in the mountain long before human miners arrived. The discovery had triggered the collapse that flooded the mine, but it had also transformed McReady into the guardian of whatever lay hidden in the mountain's depths. The missing divers had not been killed by accidents, but had been chosen by McReady to serve as his underwater crew, helping him to protect the secret of what lay buried in the deepest chambers of the mine. Each diver who entered the flooded tunnels was evaluated for their worthiness to join McReady's eternal salvage operation. Those who were selected were transformed into permanent residents of the underwater realm, while others were allowed to leave with warnings never to return. The mountain holds secrets older than gold, McReady's voice echoed through the water around them. Treasures that must not be disturbed by the living. We guard what sleeps below, ensuring that some things remain buried where they belong. The encounter ended when McReady gestured toward a passage that led deeper into the mountain, offering to show them the source of the mine's true treasure. But Royalty and Sam recognized the invitation as a test, understanding that following McReady into the depths would mean joining his underwater crew permanently. They declined the offer and began their ascent to the surface, feeling the weight of unseen eyes watching their departure. The supernatural activity ceased after their encounter with McReady, as if their refusal to join his crew had earned them safe passage out of the flooded mine. But the implications of their discovery were profound. The Treadwell mine disaster had not been an accident caused by poor engineering and high tides, but a deliberate act designed to seal away something that had been uncovered in the deepest excavations. Royalty's thesis on the Treadwell mine became a landmark work in maritime archaeology, though she was careful to focus on the historical and technical aspects of the disaster, rather than the supernatural encounters she had experienced. The flooded mine was declared off-limits to future diving operations, officially due to structural instability, but actually to prevent other divers from discovering the underwater cemetery that Thomas McReady and his crew continued to guard. Today, the Treadwell ruins are a popular hiking destination, with visitors exploring the above-ground remains of what was once Alaska's most productive gold mine. But few know that beneath the surface, in the flooded chambers that claimed so many lives, an eternal salvage operation continues. Thomas McReady and his crew of transformed divers still patrol the underwater tunnels, protecting secrets that predate human civilization and ensuring that some treasures remain forever beyond the reach of the living. The diving helmets that occasionally surface in the flooded shafts serve as reminders that the waters of Treadwell hold more than just the remnants of industrial ambition. They contain the spirits of men who chose to remain behind, standing guard over mysteries that are too dangerous for the living world to ever understand. The abandoned cabin stood like a monument to violence in the middle of what had once been flat Alaska, its weathered logs stained dark with something that decades of rain and snow had never been able to wash clean. Jason Phillips had come to the ghost town following a lead that most law enforcement officials had dismissed as folklore, but the photographs in his case file suggested otherwise. Someone had preserved a crime scene for over 40 years, maintaining it exactly as it had been left on the night 3 people were brutally murdered in this remote mining settlement. Flat had been typical of interior Alaska's boom and bust mining towns, established during the gold rush of the early 1900s and abandoned when the easily accessible ore played out in the 1950s. At its peak, the town had supported nearly 800 residents, complete with a post office, general store, and even a small hotel. But by 1960, only a handful of die-hard prospectors remained, clinging to dreams of striking it rich in claims that had been worked over for decades. The murders had occurred during the winter of 1981, when Flat's population had dwindled to fewer than a dozen year-round residents. 3 members of the Morrison family, Father Robert, Mother Sarah, and their teenage daughter Jennifer, had been found dead in their cabin by a mail carrier making his monthly delivery run. The crime scene was so brutal that the Alaska State Troopers had initially suspected a bear attack until the methodical nature of the violence became apparent. Camden Torres, a retired detective from the Anchorage Police Department, had been assigned to the Morrison case as a young trooper. The investigation had consumed 2 years of his career and haunted him for the 30 years that followed. When Camden contacted JCon about revisiting the case, he brought with him files that painted a picture of systematic murder that had been covered up to avoid panic in Alaska's remote communities. The cabin was like a slaughterhouse, Camden explained, as they approached the Morrison property on foot, following an overgrown trail that had once been Flat's main street. But it wasn't random violence. Someone had taken their time, arranged the bodies in specific positions, even cleaned up afterward. This wasn't a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. It was ritual murder. The Morrison cabin had been preserved exactly as it was found in 1981, sealed by state authorities as part of the ongoing investigation and never reopened after the case went cold. Local residents had avoided the property for decades, claiming it was cursed or haunted by the spirits of the murdered family. But JCon's research suggested a more practical reason for the preservation. Someone had been maintaining the cabin deliberately, keeping it as a shrine to their crimes. Breaking the official seal on the cabin door required authorization from the current district attorney, but Camden's connections in law enforcement had smoothed the way for their unofficial investigation. What they found inside defied both explanation and comprehension. The cabin's interior was exactly as it had been described in the 1981 crime scene reports, down to the positions of overturned furniture and the patterns of bloodstains on the walls. But impossible as it seemed, the blood was still wet. Dark red pools covered the wooden floor, still reflecting their flashlight beams as if the murders had occurred hours rather than decades ago. The metallic smell of fresh blood filled the cabin's single room, so intense that both men had to step outside to avoid retching. Whatever process was preserving the bloodstains was also maintaining their biochemical properties, creating a crime scene that existed in a state of perpetual freshness. The bodies were gone, of course, having been removed for burial after the original investigation, but their absence made the preserved blood patterns even more disturbing, creating the impression of phantom corpses whose violent deaths continued to replay in the empty cabin. Camden compared the current scene to his crime scene photographs from 1981, finding perfect matches in every detail except for the missing bodies. "This is impossible," Camden whispered, his voice shaking as he examined blood spatter patterns that should have dried and flaked away decades ago. Blood doesn't stay liquid for 40 years. Even in permafrost conditions, it would have changed color and consistency. But this looks like it happened yesterday. The investigation took on new urgency when they discovered evidence that someone had been visiting the cabin regularly over the years. Fresh footprints in the dust outside the door indicated recent activity, and inside the cabin they found personal items that had not been documented in the original crime scene reports. A leather journal, written in multiple hands over several decades, contained detailed observations about the preservation of the blood and speculation about the supernatural forces maintaining the scene. The journal entries, dating back to 1985, revealed that at least a dozen people had discovered the preserved crime scene over the years. Most had been hunters or prospectors exploring the abandoned town, but several entries appeared to be written by law enforcement officials who had visited the cabin during follow-up investigations. All described the same impossible phenomenon, a 40-year-old crime scene that remained perfectly preserved in a state of perpetual freshness. More disturbing were the entries that suggested the preservation was not natural or accidental, but the result of deliberate intervention. Several writers described finding candles that had been recently lit, ritual objects arranged around the bloodstains, and symbols carved into the cabin walls that had not been present during the original investigation. Someone had been using the Morrison cabin as a shrine, maintaining the crime scene as a memorial to their murders. The breakthrough came when Jay Sion discovered that the cabin's preservation coincided with a pattern of similar murders across remote Alaska communities. Between 1981 and 2019, 17 families in isolated settlements had been killed in circumstances nearly identical to the Morrison murders. In each case, the victims had been arranged in ritualistic positions, the crime scenes had been carefully cleaned of evidence, and the investigations had been abandoned due to lack of leads or suspects. But unlike the Morrison cabin, these other crime scenes had not been preserved. The blood had dried normally, the scenes had been cleaned, and the properties eventually sold or abandoned. Only the Morrison cabin remained frozen in time, suggesting that it held special significance for the killer. It was not just another murder scene, but the first in a series that had continued for nearly 4 decades. Camden's review of the case files revealed connections between the murders that the original investigations had missed. All of the victim families had been recent arrivals to their communities, city dwellers who had moved to remote Alaska seeking isolation or adventure. None had deep roots in their adopted communities, making them ideal targets for a killer who understood that their deaths would generate minimal investigation and media attention. Most significantly, all of the murders had occurred in communities that were connected to Flat, either geographically or historically. The killer was someone with intimate knowledge of interior Alaska's mining history, someone who could move between remote communities without attracting attention, and someone who had been operating undetected for nearly 40 years. The investigation led them to examine the backgrounds of people who had lived in or visited Flat during the 1970s and early 1980s. The list was surprisingly short, as the town's population had been minimal during its final years. But one name appeared repeatedly in the records: Marcus Henley, a surveyor and mineral rights consultant who had worked throughout interior Alaska for over 5 decades. Henley had been in Flat during the winter of 1981, conducting a mineral survey for a mining company interested in reopening some of the area's abandoned claims. He had stayed at the Morrison cabin for several weeks while conducting his survey, establishing a relationship with the family that made him one of the last people to see them alive. But his alibi had been solid. He had been in Anchorage meeting with clients when the bodies were discovered, and he had never been considered a serious suspect. But Jason's research revealed discrepancies in Henley's travel records that suggested he had made multiple undocumented trips back to Flat after the murders. More damning was the discovery that Henley had been present in the vicinity of all 17 murder locations in the weeks or months preceding each crime. His work as a surveyor provided perfect cover for traveling to remote communities, establishing relationships with potential victims, and disappearing before the bodies were discovered. The confrontation with Henley took place at his cabin near Fairbanks, where the 87-year-old killer was living in retirement. Far from denying his crimes, Henley seemed relieved to finally discuss the murders that had defined his adult life. He explained that the killings were not random acts of violence, but part of a decades-long ritual designed to preserve the pure Alaska that he remembered from his youth. "These people came up here thinking they could play pioneer," Henley said calmly, as Camden placed him under arrest. "City folks who wanted to pretend they were living the frontier life, but they had no understanding of what Alaska really demands. I was showing them the truth about this place. It doesn't forgive weakness or ignorance." Henley's confession revealed the full scope of his crimes, including murders that had not been connected to the pattern because the bodies had never been found. He had been killing newcomers to remote Alaska communities for over 40 years, selecting victims who fitted his criteria for unworthy residents. The Morrison family had been his first victims, and their cabin had become his personal shrine, maintained through a combination of natural preservation conditions and ritual practices that kept the blood from aging. The supernatural preservation of the Morrison cabin was explained not by paranormal forces, but by Henley's deliberate efforts to maintain the crime scene. He had been making regular pilgrimages to Flat for decades, performing rituals that involved refreshing the bloodstains with animal blood and maintaining the cabin's interior exactly as it had been on the night of the murders. The fresh blood that Jason and Camden had discovered was actually a mixture of the original human blood and decades of animal blood that Henley had used to maintain his shrine. The arrest of Marcus Henley solved 17 cold case murders and provided closure for families who had waited decades for answers about their lost loved ones. The Morrison cabin was finally cleaned and sealed permanently, ending 40 years of preserved horror in the abandoned town of Flat. But the case raised disturbing questions about how many other killers might be operating undetected in Alaska's remote communities, protected by vast distances and minimal law enforcement presence. Today, Flat remains abandoned, its few remaining buildings slowly succumbing to the elements and the encroaching wilderness. The Morrison cabin stands empty and clean, no longer a shrine to violence, but simply another abandoned structure in a ghost town that has seen too much tragedy. But sometimes visitors to the area report seeing lights in the cabin windows on winter nights and the faint sound of voices that seem to be calling for help that will never come. The flat murders serve as a reminder that Alaska's isolation, which attracts people seeking solitude and adventure, can also provide perfect cover for predators who understand how to exploit the state's vast emptiness and sparse population. In a place where towns can disappear entirely and people can vanish without anyone knowing they were ever there, the line between wilderness adventure and mortal danger is often thinner than outsiders realize. Marcus Henley died in prison 3 years after his conviction, taking with him the locations of victims whose bodies were never found and secrets about other crimes that may never be solved. But his capture ended a reign of terror that had lasted nearly half a century, proving that even in Alaska's most remote corners, justice can eventually find those who believe the wilderness gives them license to kill. The reserved blood in the Morrison cabin may have been the result of human intervention rather than supernatural forces, but the horror it represented was real enough. For 40 years, a killer had maintained his own private museum of murder, visiting regularly to relive his first successful hunt and to plan the next addition to his collection of dead families who had made the mistake of seeking a new life in Alaska's unforgiving frontier. The aurora borealis painted the October sky in sheets of emerald and gold when Princeton Hayes first heard the Morse code transmission echoing across the abandoned town of Solomon. The rhythmic tapping came from somewhere among the cluster of weathered buildings that had once housed over 300 gold miners during the height of the Nome Gold Rush. But Solomon had been a ghost town for decades, its residents long gone, its telegraph lines cut and removed years ago. There should have been no way for anyone to send Morse code from the deserted settlement. Princeton had come to Solomon as part of an investigation into electromagnetic anomalies reported in the area during aurora activity. As a researcher specializing in atmospheric physics and radio phenomena, he was accustomed to unusual signals that accompanied geomagnetic storms. But the transmissions from Solomon were different. They followed the precise timing and formatting of early 20th century telegraph communications, complete with call signs and operational codes that matched historical records from the town's active period. Jacai Martinez, a historian and amateur radio operator, had joined Princeton's investigation after analyzing recordings of the mysterious transmissions. The signals contained specific references to mining operations, supply shipments, and personnel changes that corresponded exactly to actual events from Solomon's past. But the most disturbing aspect of the transmissions was their apparent real-time nature. The signals described events as if they were happening in the present, despite the fact that Solomon had been abandoned since the 1950s. Solomon had been established in 1900 as a supply and transportation hub for the gold fields around Nome. Unlike many boom towns that appeared overnight and disappeared just as quickly, Solomon had been carefully planned and built to last. The town featured a railroad station, telegraph office, general store, hotel, and residential district that could accommodate both permanent residents and transient miners. At its peak, Solomon served as the vital link between the remote mining camps and the outside world. The town's decline began in the 1920s, when the easily accessible gold played out, and mining companies shifted their operations to more promising locations. By 1940, Solomon's population had dwindled to fewer than 50 residents, mostly elderly couples who had established roots during the town's prosperous years. The final blow came in 1951 when the Alaska Railroad discontinued service to Solomon, severing the town's last connection to the modern world. Within a year, the remaining residents had relocated, leaving Solomon to the elements. The first night Princeton and Jacai spent in Solomon, they set up their equipment in what had been the town's telegraph office. The building was remarkably well preserved, its interior still containing the original telegraph key, switchboard, and cable routing systems. According to historical records, the office had been the communication lifeline for dozens of mining camps scattered throughout the surrounding wilderness. Every day, Hundreds of messages had been transmitted through this single room, coordinating supply deliveries, personnel transfers, and emergency communications across thousands of square miles. As the Aurora began its nightly display, the telegraph key started moving. Not the random tapping of thermal expansion or building settling, but the precise, rhythmic patterns of practiced Morse code. Princeton's equipment recorded the signals while Jakai translated the messages in real time. What they heard was a detailed conversation between the Solomon Telegraph Office and various mining camps, discussing production reports, weather conditions, and logistical challenges exactly as such communications would have occurred during the town's operational period. Camp 7 reports heavy snow blocking access to Claim 42, Jakai translated, as the ghost telegraph continued its transmission, requesting immediate supply drop, including medical supplies and additional personnel for snow removal operations. The transmission was followed by a response from the Solomon office, confirming receipt of the message and promising to coordinate with Nome for supply delivery. The entire exchange followed proper telegraph protocols and used terminology that was specific to early 20th century mining operations. But most unnervingly, the weather conditions described in the messages matched the current atmospheric conditions outside the abandoned telegraph office. Princeton's scientific instruments detected no electromagnetic activity that could account for the telegraph signals. The building had no electrical power. The original telegraph lines had been removed decades earlier, and there were no radio transmitters in the immediate area capable of generating the signals they were recording. The Morse code appeared to be originating from the telegraph key itself, operating without any identifiable power source or transmission medium. The phenomena intensified over the following nights as Princeton and Jakai expanded their investigation to other buildings throughout Solomon. They discovered that the entire town was experiencing supernatural communication activity during Aurora displays. The railroad station received phantom train schedules and cargo manifests. The general store's telephone rang with orders for supplies that had not been manufactured in decades, and the hotel's front desk bell chimed to announce the arrival of guests who could never be seen. But it was the signals from the residential district that proved most disturbing. Houses that had been abandoned for 70 years were transmitting what appeared to be personal communications from their former residents. Family messages about children's health, discussions of mining prospects, and plans for future visits to the outside world. The transmissions suggested that the spirits of Solomon's former residents were continuing to live their lives exactly as they had during the town's active period, unaware that the world had moved on without them. Jakai's research into Solomon's history revealed that the town had experienced unusual electromagnetic phenomena even during its operational years. Miners and residents had reported strange lights in the sky that were distinct from the aurora, telegraph equipment that operated independently, and radio signals that seemed to originate from empty wilderness areas. Local Native American tribes had traditional stories about the area being a place where the spirits of the dead could communicate with the living, particularly during times when the aurora was most active. The breakthrough in understanding the phenomena came when Princeton discovered that Solomon was located directly beneath one of the most active aurora corridors in North America. The town's position at the intersection of several magnetic field lines created a natural electromagnetic focusing effect that was amplified during geomagnetic storms. Combined with the high mineral content of the local soil, which included significant deposits of magnetite and other conductive minerals, Solomon existed in a unique environment where electromagnetic energy could be concentrated and stored. Princeton theorized that the intense electromagnetic activity during Solomon's active years had created a form of electromagnetic recording in the town's infrastructure. The telegraph lines, telephone wires, and other metallic installations had absorbed and retained the electromagnetic signatures of the communications that had passed through them for 50 years. During aurora displays, when the electromagnetic environment became highly charged, These stored signals were being replayed like ghostly recordings from the past, but the theory could not explain why the signals appeared to be interactive and responsive to current conditions. The phantom communications were not simple replays of historical messages, but seemed to be generated in real time by entities that were aware of present circumstances. The weather reports matched current conditions. The personnel discussions referenced actual people who could be verified in historical records, and the operational decisions reflected the kind of adaptive problem-solving that required conscious intelligence. The most profound encounter occurred on their final night in Solomon, when Princeton and Jakai established direct communication with the phantom telegraph operator. Using a restored telegraph key, they were able to send messages that received immediate responses from the ghostly operator, who identified himself as William Morrison, Solomon's chief telegraph officer from 1903 to 1924. Morrison explained through Morse code that he and many other residents of Solomon had never truly left the town. Their deep attachment to the community and their sense of responsibility for maintaining communication services had anchored their spirits to the location even after their physical deaths. They continued to operate Solomon's communication systems, serving mining camps and communities that existed only in the electromagnetic memory of the aurora-charged landscape. "We are the bridge between worlds," Morrison's signal tapped out slowly. "The living send their messages through the skyfire, and we carry them to where they need to go." Solomon never closed. "We just changed the nature of our service." The ghostly operators revealed that they were aware of the passage of time and the changes that had occurred in the world beyond Solomon, but their sense of purpose remained unchanged. They continued to facilitate communication between isolated communities, serving travelers and adventurers who found themselves in need of emergency contact with the outside world. The Aurora provided the power for their operations, and their ethereal existence allowed them to maintain services that would have been impossible for the living. Princeton and Jakai's investigation concluded with the understanding that Solomon represented a unique form of technological haunting, where the spirits of the dead had merged with the electromagnetic infrastructure of their former community. The town served as a supernatural communication hub, bridging the gap between the physical and spiritual worlds through the medium of aurora-charged electromagnetic energy. Their documentation of the Solomon phenomena attracted international attention from researchers studying the intersection of consciousness and electromagnetic fields. The town became a pilgrimage site for investigators seeking evidence that human consciousness could survive physical death and interact with technological systems. But the phantom operators made it clear that they were not interested in fame or scientific study. Their mission was to serve, just as they had in life. Today, Solomon remains abandoned by the living but fully operational in the realm of the supernatural. During aurora displays, amateur radio operators across Alaska report receiving signals from the abandoned town, offering weather reports, emergency assistance, and connections to loved ones who have passed beyond the physical world. The ghost telegraph operators continue their eternal shift, proving that some forms of service transcend even death itself. Princeton and Jakai's research established Solomon as one of the most documented cases of technological haunting in the scientific literature. But for the phantom operators who maintain the town's supernatural communication network, the investigation was simply another day at the office. In Solomon, the dead continue to serve the living, ensuring that no call for help goes unanswered, regardless of which side of the grave it originates from. The aurora still dances across the Solomon sky every clear night, providing power for communications that link the past and present in ways that science is only beginning to understand. In a world increasingly dependent on digital technology, the ghost town of Solomon serves as a reminder that some forms of human connection are eternal, transcending both death and the march of technological progress. The night signals continue to emanate from Solomon's abandoned telegraph office, carrying messages between worlds and proving that even in death, dedicated public servants never truly abandon their posts. The howling began at midnight, just as it had every night since Braylon Carter arrived, in the ghost town of Iditarod 3 days earlier. But tonight was different. Tonight he could see the pack running through the abandoned streets, their forms translucent but unmistakably real, led by a musher whose face remained hidden beneath the shadow of a fur-lined hood. The ghostly sled dogs moved with the synchronized precision of a championship team, their phantom paws making no sound on the snow-covered ground as they traced the same route through the town night after night. Braylon had come to Iditarod searching for his missing research partner, Khaleesi Monroe, who had vanished while conducting archaeological surveys in the abandoned mining settlement. Her last radio transmission had been fragmented and disturbing, describing voices calling to her from empty buildings and the sound of dog teams running through the streets of a town that had been abandoned for over 60 years. When search and rescue teams failed to locate her, Braylon had mounted his own investigation, following her research notes to a ghost town that harbored secrets darker than the endless Alaskan winter. Iditarod had been the supply hub for one of Alaska's richest gold mining districts during the early 1900s, serving thousands of prospectors who worked claims scattered throughout the Inaco River Valley. At its peak, the town supported over 10,000 residents, complete with banks, hotels, newspapers, and all the amenities of a thriving frontier community. But when the easily accessible gold played out in the 1920s and the Great Depression devastated commodity prices, Iditarod's population dwindled rapidly. By 1940, fewer than 100 people remained, and by 1960, the town was completely abandoned. What made Iditarod unique among Alaska's ghost towns was its connection to the state's dog sledding culture. The town had been a major checkpoint on the original Iditarod Trail, the 1,000-mile route that connected the remote mining districts to the port city of Seward. During the winter months, dog teams were the only reliable form of transportation across the frozen wilderness, carrying mail, supplies, and passengers through conditions that would have been impossible for any other mode of travel. The phantom dog team that Braylon witnessed was not the first supernatural manifestation he had encountered in Iditarod. Every building in the ghost town seemed to be occupied by invisible residents who continued to live their daily routines as if the town were still thriving. Footsteps echoed through abandoned hotels, phantom conversations drifted from empty saloons, and the old general store's cash register chimed regularly as if processing sales to customers who no longer existed. Khaleesi's research notes, found scattered throughout her abandoned campsite, provided clues to the supernatural activity that had consumed her investigation. She had discovered that Iditarod was experiencing what she termed temporal displacement, where events from the town's past were bleeding through into the present. The ghost town was not simply abandoned, but was caught in a supernatural loop that replayed significant moments from its history on an endless cycle. The phenomena became more intense as Braylon explored deeper into the town's residential district. Houses that had been empty for decades showed signs of recent habitation, with warm light glowing from windows and smoke rising from chimneys that should have been cold and dark. When he investigated these apparent signs of life, the buildings were always empty, but the residual warmth and the smell of cooking food suggested that invisible families were continuing to live their lives within the walls. Most disturbing were the voices that called to him from the abandoned buildings, using Khaleesi's name and begging for help. The voices spoke in the accents and dialect of early 20th century Alaska, suggesting they belonged to the spirits of Iditarod's former residents. But their messages were contemporary, describing Khaleesi's research and expressing concern for her safety. It was as if the dead were trying to warn the living about dangers that transcended the boundaries between past and present. Braylon's breakthrough came when he discovered Khaleesi's final research site in what had been Iditarod's dog yard, where hundreds of sled dogs had been housed during the town's operational years. Her excavation had uncovered a mass grave containing the remains of dozens of sled dogs, along with evidence of systematic poisoning that had killed the animals during the harsh winter of 1925. According to historical records, a diphtheria outbreak in Nome had required emergency delivery of antitoxin serum, leading to the famous serum run that became the inspiration for the modern Iditarod trail sled dog race. But Khaleesi's research had revealed a darker truth about that heroic rescue mission. The serum run had been successful, saving the children of Nome from the diphtheria epidemic, but the emergency had required commandeering the best dog teams from communities throughout Alaska, including Iditarod. The dogs that remained in the mining town were the older, weaker animals that were not suitable for the dangerous 1,000-mile journey to Nome. When food supplies ran low during the extended winter, these abandoned dogs had been systematically poisoned to prevent them from suffering slow starvation. The mass grave represented the final betrayal of the loyal animals that had served Iditarod's residents faithfully for decades. The dogs had been killed not out of cruelty, but out of a misguided sense of mercy that had traumatized the entire community. Many of the miners and their families had been so devastated by the necessity of killing their beloved sled dogs that they had abandoned Iditarod permanently, unable to remain in a place where they had been forced to betray their most faithful companions. The supernatural activity in Iditarod was the manifestation of this collective trauma, with the spirits of the poisoned dogs and their guilty owners trapped in an eternal cycle of remorse and longing. The phantom dog team that ran through the streets every night represented the animals' continued loyalty to their human partners, while the voices calling from empty buildings were the spirits of mushers who could never forgive themselves for the choices they had been forced to make. Braylon's investigation reached its climax when he followed the ghostly dog team to its destination at the edge of town, where the trail led into the wilderness toward Nome. There, he found Khaleesi alive, but in a state of supernatural suspension, standing motionless beside a spectral sled, as if waiting for a journey that would never begin. She was conscious and aware, but unable to move or speak, held in place by the spirits of the abandoned dogs who had chosen her as their new musher for the eternal race they could never finish. The ghost dogs had not meant to harm Khaleesi, but had been drawn to her empathy and understanding of their tragic fate. Her research had given voice to their story, acknowledging the suffering that had been hidden for nearly a century. In response, they had chosen her to lead them on the spectral version of the serum run, the heroic journey they had been denied in life because they were deemed too old or weak to participate. Breaking the supernatural hold on Khaleesi required Braylon to complete the ritual that the ghost dogs needed to find peace. Using information from Khaleesi's research notes, he conducted a memorial service for the poisoned animals, reading their names from the historical records and acknowledging their sacrifice. He explained that their deaths had not been meaningless, but had been part of the larger heroic effort to save the children of Nome, even if they had not been able to participate directly in the famous serum run. The ceremony allowed the spirits of both the dogs and their owners to finally find forgiveness and peace. The ghostly sled team appeared one final time, no longer translucent, but solid and real, led by a musher whose face was finally visible as he nodded his thanks to Braylon. The phantom dogs howled in triumph rather than anguish, and the entire spectral procession began moving toward the wilderness, finally able to complete their interrupted journey to Nome. As the ghost team disappeared into the aurora-lit darkness, Khaleesi was released from her supernatural suspension. She retained full memory of her experience, describing how the spirits had shown her the complete history of Iditarod's decline and the tragedy that had driven away its final residents. The ghost dogs had not been trying to harm her, but had been desperate to share their story with someone who would understand and remember their sacrifice. Khaleesi and Braelen's documentation of the Iditarod hauntings provided closure for a century-old trauma that had been buried by shame and forgotten by history. Their research revealed that the supernatural activity in many of Alaska's ghost towns was connected to unresolved emotional trauma from the past, with the spirits of the dead seeking acknowledgement and understanding from the living. The town of Iditarod remains abandoned today, but it is no longer haunted. The midnight howling has ceased. The phantom footsteps no longer echo through empty buildings, and the ghostly dog team no longer runs through the snow-covered streets. The spirits have found peace, finally able to complete their eternal journey, knowing that their story has been told and their sacrifice acknowledged. But sometimes, especially during the modern Iditarod trail sled dog race that commemorates the heroic Serum Run, mushers report seeing a ghostly team running parallel to their own sleds as they pass through the wilderness near the abandoned town. The phantom dogs and their spectral musher appear to be racing alongside the modern competitors, finally able to participate in the great race they had been denied in life. The final haunt of Iditarod was not one of terror or malevolence, but of love and loyalty that transcended death itself. The ghost dogs had remained not to frighten the living, but to ensure that their devotion to their human partners would never be forgotten. In death as in life, they had proven that the bond between mushers and their sled dogs is stronger than time, stronger than guilt, and stronger than the grave itself. Today, visitors to the Iditarod ghost town find only empty buildings and wind-swept streets, but the legacy of the faithful sled dogs lives on in the stories told by mushers and the annual race that bears the town's name. The final haunt has ended, but the love and loyalty it represented will continue as long as dogs and humans share the trails of the Alaskan wilderness, running together toward horizons that exist beyond the boundaries of the physical world.